December 7th, 1941, 7:48 in the morning. Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. 353 Japanese aircraft appeared out of the clouds in 2 waves and spent less than 2 hours dismantling the United States Pacific Fleet. 8 battleships damaged or sunk. 188 aircraft destroyed on the ground. 2,403 Americans dead. The attack was so sudden, so complete, so savage, that the men on the ground thought at first it was a training exercise gone wrong. It was not. The next day, Franklin Roosevelt stood before Congress and called December 7th a date which will live in infamy. Congress declared war on Japan with a single dissenting vote, the lone pacifist Congresswoman Jeannette Rankin, who had also voted against entering World War I. 4 days later, Adolf Hitler solved Roosevelt's biggest political problem by declaring war on the United States himself. America was now in the war, both wars, simultaneously. Everything that followed the liberation of Europe, the defeat of Japan, the atomic bomb, the birth of the United States as the world's dominant superpower, the Cold War, the entire architecture of the modern world, flows from those 2 hours on a Sunday morning in Hawaii. But what if the Japanese planes had never taken off? To understand why this question matters so much, you have to understand what America looked like on December 6th, 1941, the day before the attack. The country was not at war. It was not about to go to war. The most powerful political movement in America at the time was called America First, a coalition of millions of ordinary citizens, prominent politicians, and cultural figures who were absolutely determined to keep the United States out of European conflicts. Their most famous spokesman was Charles Lindbergh, the most celebrated man in America, who drew crowds of tens of thousands to rallies arguing that the war in Europe was not America's problem. Roosevelt had been trying for 2 years to maneuver the country toward intervention. He had pushed through Lend-Lease, which gave billions in military equipment to Britain and the Soviet Union. He had embargoed oil exports to Japan, which was the primary reason Japan decided to attack in the first place. They needed oil to continue their war in China, and the American embargo was strangling them. But getting Congress to actually declare war, that was politically impossible. When polled in the months before Pearl Harbor, the majority of Americans consistently said they did not want their sons sent to fight in Europe. Pearl Harbor ended that debate in a single morning. The National World War II Museum has written that the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941 ended the debate over American intervention in both the Pacific and European theaters of World War II. The day after, Congress declared war on Japan with only a single dissenting vote. Isolation was no longer an option. So in a world where Pearl Harbor never happens, that debate does not end. It continues, and Roosevelt, brilliant, determined, and utterly convinced that a Nazi-dominated Europe was an existential threat to American democracy, has no clean way to win it. Here is the specific technical problem. Japan attacks Pearl Harbor. America declares war on Japan. Hitler then declares war on America, giving Roosevelt the European entry he needed. Without Pearl Harbor, America declares nothing. And Hitler, whatever his other catastrophic miscalculations, was not certain to repeat the one that brought America into the European war. The National World War II Museum notes that Germany waited until December 11th, 4 days after Pearl Harbor, to declare war on the United States, and that the Americans quickly responded in kind. Remove Pearl Harbor, and Hitler has every reason to keep America out of the European war while he consolidates his gains in the East. So what happens to World War II in a world where America stays home? Britain survives. It had already survived the Battle of Britain in 1940. and by late 1941 the Luftwaffe's attempt to bomb it into submission had failed. Britain does not fall without American entry, but it also cannot beat Germany alone. The Royal Air Force can defend the island. The Royal Navy can keep the sea lanes open. But invading Nazi-occupied France, pushing through North Africa, liberating Italy, none of that happens without American men and American equipment on a massive scale. The Soviet Union is carrying the entire land war against Germany. By December 1941, the exact moment Pearl Harbor happened, the Germans had already reached the outskirts of Moscow and then been thrown back by a Soviet counteroffensive in brutal winter conditions. The war on the Eastern Front was going to be long, catastrophic, and decided in blood on a scale that dwarfs everything else in human history. In our timeline, American Lend-Lease provided the Soviets with hundreds of thousands of trucks, jeeps, aircraft, and millions of tons of food that kept the Red Army mobile and fed while it ground Germany down. Without that supply, the Soviet war effort is harder, slower, and more costly. But the Soviets do not lose. This is the crucial point that most people miss. Germany could not have conquered the Soviet Union even without American involvement. The country was simply too large, the population too vast, the ideological resistance too fierce. What changes is not whether Germany eventually loses on the Eastern Front. What changes is how long it takes and how far west the Soviet army is standing when Germany finally collapses. University of Exeter historian Richard Overy, one of the foremost authorities on World War II, has argued precisely this. Without Pearl Harbor and without American entry, the conflict would likely have been extended by months, if not years, with profound consequences for post-war power distributions. The Soviet Union would have borne an even greater burden against Nazi Germany, likely resulting in greater territorial gains and influence in the post-war settlement. Think about what that means in practical terms. In our timeline, American forces liberated France, Belgium, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, Denmark, Western Germany, Austria, and Italy. Soviet forces liberated Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, Yugoslavia, Eastern Germany, and the Baltic states. That division of Europe became the Iron Curtain, the Cold War, and 40 years of divided continent. Without American forces in the West, Soviet forces fill the vacuum. Paris may well be liberated by the Red Army rather than by American and Free French troops. Western Germany, the industrial heartland of Europe, may fall under Soviet occupation rather than American. The Marshall Plan. The American program that rebuilt Western Europe's economy after the war and tied it to the democratic West never happens, because there is no American-controlled Western Europe to rebuild. The Europe that emerges from a war won without American involvement is a Soviet-dominated Europe. Not necessarily communist in every country, but deeply under Moscow's influence, from the Atlantic coast to the Russian border. The political map of the continent for the next half-century looks nothing like the one we know. And then there is Japan. Without Pearl Harbor, Japan and the United States are not at war. Japan continues its expansion through Southeast Asia, occupying the Philippines, the Dutch East Indies, British Malaya, Singapore. These are enormous strategic prizes. Without American naval and ground forces pushing back across the Pacific, Japan consolidates an empire spanning from Manchuria to the edges of Australia. Not indefinitely, the economic strain would eventually become unsustainable, and Britain and the residual Allied forces would continue fighting in Asia. But Japan holds that empire for years longer than it did in our timeline. The atomic bomb, developed in our world specifically to end the Pacific War without a catastrophic land invasion of Japan, might still be built. Roosevelt and Churchill authorized its development before Pearl Harbor, but its use, its timing, and its consequences all shift in ways impossible to fully predict. There is one more dimension of this alternate world that deserves attention. In our timeline, the United States emerged from World War II as the uncontested economic and military superpower of the Western world. The American economy, stimulated by wartime production, had grown so large and so technologically advanced that it produced roughly half of total global economic output in 1945. That position of strength underwrote everything that followed the United Nations, the IMF, the World Bank, NATO, the entire international order that has governed global politics ever since. A United States that sat out the war, or entered it late and on more limited terms, does not emerge from it in the same position. It is richer than the devastated combatants, yes, but it is not the indispensable nation in the same way. The American century, the idea that the 20th century belonged to the United States, that American power and American ideas would shape the world, simply does not happen in the same form. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the Japanese commander who planned the Pearl Harbor attack, reportedly told his superiors before launching it that he feared they had awakened a sleeping giant and filled it with a terrible resolve. He was right, and he knew it. The attack that Japan launched to cripple American power in the Pacific had precisely the opposite effect. It turned a nation of reluctant bystanders into the most motivated fighting force in the world, and set in motion the chain of events that made America the most powerful country in human history. Japan's boldest stroke became, in the long view of history, its most catastrophic mistake. Did Pearl Harbor make America, or did America's response to Pearl Harbor make the modern world? Drop your answer below.